Shabbat Shalom, and welcome back. Parshat Noach, as I started mentioning earlier, is a complicated portion and one filled with many different tales and stories, but I'd like to expand a little bit the story of Noah, and I'm beginning by asking you a simple question. It's actually about simple. Was Noah a simple person? Was Noah simple? Or was he incredibly complicated? Who was he? What do his actions say about Noah? What do his outcomes say about Noah? Was he chosen because he was simple and he would just do what God told him? Or was he chosen because he actually would enhance the message and the concept? It's not clear who Noah is, but if we start to explore a little bit about Noah, we start to find that Noah is definitely part of a very complex story. Whether he himself is complicated or not is not so clear. And it begins when I was in grade 1. The first day I went to school in grade 1, I came in to we called him a Rebbe. The Rebbe, not a Hasidic Rebbe, a teacher. Rebbe means a teacher. And my Rebbe that day was a jovial, Rebbe-looking fellow, looked a lot like Kris Kringle, but Rebbe-looking fellow whose name was Rabbi Yakubovich, or Rabbi Jacobowitz, or as his brother was known, Lou Jacoby, you see? But we didn't know that in grade 1. And Rabbi Jacobowitz, or Yakubovich, had 10 children from what we remembered, what I knew. And in grade 1, we found out a lot of interesting things. I had immigrated from the United States, and it was my first year in Canada, and we moved from LA. And grade 1, and the first day we walk in, we get our seats and so on. I don't remember much, but I do remember the first thing happening is we open the book and we start to read. Bereshis in Anfang, Bara Elohim, hot the Eibishter bat Shafen, Eis HaShemayim ve'Eis HaOretz. You realize what happened? We started in Hebrew and we translated in Yiddish, and I never knew Yiddish. Well, within days, I learned Yiddish because we had the Hebrew, we had the Yiddish, and of course there was English explanation, but we read in Hebrew, translated in Yiddish, and I learned a new language literally overnight. 2 new languages, Hebrew and Yiddish, and probably augmented my English as well. Well, if I think back about what I learned during those early years, initially, I had this visual of Adam and Eve. It kind of made sense, this story of people, I don't know, they didn't behave, they were punished. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. The wife of Adam being made from a rib, I don't know, I wasn't a scientist. I could imagine. But then the stories over time started to they started to drift a little bit, and they started to become a little less believable. And of course, when you grow up in that world, like, when you have a log cabin, you got an empty space that air gets through, you take some moss and some mud, you stuff it in, and you put a little chink in there, and guess what? It fills in the spaces. Whenever they got stuck at a story, it was easy. It took a bit of moss and mud in the rabbinic sense, which was a midrash, a teaching, a miracle. Whenever you were stuck, it was a miracle. Can't argue with miracles because God runs the world, and if God wants to make miracles, God makes miracles. So as a child, I started to learn that there's a solution for every problem, a miracle, or some unusual event that took place perhaps on a one-time basis or represented, a world long gone. We don't understand it. And that's how everything made sense. And when we got to the story of Noah, even as a young child in grade 1, I recall the joy of being able to imagine having all the animals in the world in my own boat. There's a menagerie. It's beautiful. Who wouldn't want that? To have a zoo in your own backyard? And of course, that year we happened to have visited Riverdale Zoo in the old days, when it wasn't such a great zoo. And we started to learn more and more stories, and the more you learned, the more miracles you needed to have them make sense in order to allow you to understand the derech HaTorah, the way to think about Torah. You had to learn with miracles to backstop all the little missing pieces. Now, perhaps some of what we call miracles are legends or myths, but when you base an entire faith and principle on the Torah, and you start to backfill it with little bits and pieces, even young kids can often look at it and go, I love it, but I don't think it's real. And that's what happened to me. It wasn't real. And I knew it. I knew it wasn't real because they worked too hard to make it real. And the problem was that once you bought into the miracles, the rabbis, could tell you anything they wanted. Because all they had to do was tell you it was a miracle, and you can't argue with it. And they would tell you it was a miracle, and we don't argue, and if you argue, you're a heretic. You don't argue. And the power within the ability to fill any gap in any story, no matter how preposterous or ridiculous, with a miracle, strains the value of the story. Now, remember, I'm in grade 1 and 2 and 3, and I'm learning Torah, and I know that there's a stream called the miraculous, which figures out all the problems, especially the contradictions with our Jewish life at the time. So in other words, when Abraham has guests and he brings them butter and meat and bread and serves it at the same table, there's a lot of shenanigans to make that meat not fleishix, or to suggest that somehow it was acceptable, because the underlying premise is always that our ancestors kept the entire Torah, which is maybe eye-opening for you. It's absurd in my opinion. Not absurd that they would have had a set of values and laws. Why wouldn't humanity have had that from day one? They weren't necessarily, people who started out of middle of nowhere and with no values. People always have had values and societal structures. I don't suggest that they were just, basically, Neanderthals in that sense. Sorry, apologize to all the Neanderthals watching. What really happens here is that they try to frame every story in the Torah within the black hat worldview. In other words, Abraham was a religious Jew. And any contradiction, we will find a miracle or some way to massage it so that we always maintain the religious Jew from history. And sorry to tell you, the first Jews really don't start until the Hebrews, and really don't start until Exodus, and really don't start until they arrive in the land of Israel. And even then, in the form that we understand Judaism, does not happen until they end up in the land of Judah and Benjamin and the land of Israel under a political dynasty of Saul and King David. And even then, they only start to build that over time. There is no need for Abraham to be an Orthodox Jew to tell the story. There's no need to backstop it with miracles when the story itself is so powerful. And the story of Noah, taught to children, should be considered something that they have the right to understand as a fable or as reality, because they're both plausible if you're willing to go there. Now, it's interesting because Allegra is 7, and she's a mature 7. She's a great kid. Allegra, if you're watching, I'm so proud of you. You're just such an amazing, amazing daughter. And it's funny because a few days ago, I played a song for her that she loved. She loved nonstop. For a long time, she could listen to the same song over and over and over, and she gave me a face like, what am I, a baby? Allegra, that was yesterday. Yeah, but today is today. I'm not a baby anymore. That song is over. For now, maybe she'll go back to it. And to her credit, so be it. You're done, you're done. You move on. You see yourself as growing up, you grow up. Now you're on to My Little Pony. God bless you. Here's your little pony. Can't argue with that. But imagine if children's creativity and imagination is squashed because the moment they start to say, I don't think this is real, and I want to grow up. I want to grow up even while reading Torah. I don't want to be infantilized by a story that has to remain a miracle-based, backfilled, impossible tale, at least by modern standards, and for you to force me to believe that every single detail that you've projected onto it is true belies my maturity. It belies my ability to grow with a story and make it my own. And it ruins for me the ability to appreciate Torah as not a living document historically, but a living document in my own life. So when we get to the story of Noah and the flood and the ark and the animals, and if you read the story carefully, it's kind of plausible. It wouldn't bother me at all if someone could structurally lay out this story, and people have done it, so that it's scientifically feasible. And guess what? If it's not scientifically feasible, that's okay with me. I'm okay with it not being real. But I'm really fascinated by why this story is important. And this is a message I've delivered many, many, many times. It doesn't matter at the end of the day if it was real. Probably some degree it was. To spend your life proving it's real, to what end? What are you going to get out of proving that it's real? That what? You can leverage that into proving that you're true and you're right, and therefore everyone else has to listen to you? What leverage is there in truth when you've wasted your whole life trying to prove something that doesn't matter? So I say, the story is true. The story is true. The details are not. But who cares? So the details of Noah's story, read textually, are infantilizing. The concepts that come out of Noah's story are so deep and so broad, and that's what I want to share with you. But I feel it's important to reiterate because I hear from people over and over and over again, Rabbi, I went to school and they taught me blah, and I'm thinking, did you ever update the story? No, not really. I never really thought of it that way. Well, and I know why. Because you were told that that's the story. And you were told that there's only one way to understand it. And you were told that the power does not reside within you to understand or interpret and localize the story. You were told there's a national narrative at stake. Don't you dare tamper with it. It's all wrong. Tamper with it. Make it your own. Don't let the Torah be infantile. So was Noah a simple man? No. Noah was a very complex person. Why did Noah do what Noah did? Well, Noah builds this ark. So let's assume that there's a guy named Noah who actually does build an ark for a flood, and he actually has a premonition. He's a prepper. He's a doomsday prepper. And I need not tell you, because if you read the news, you know this. Depends which news you read. Sales of military gear and firearms and ammunition and freeze-dried foods and bulletproof vests and all the things that you might need in the event of a civil war have gone through the roof in the United States. Understandable. It's a mess. However, Noah is one of those people. He decides there's going to be a flood. Is he told by God? Maybe, I don't know. But he actually decides to convert his front lawn into a shipbuilding yard. And he does. And he's mocked incessantly. He doesn't give it up, though. He insists. And then at some point, there's a deluge, and he's proven correct. In the meantime, he goes and collects species of all the species he can get so that he can keep breeding pairs for the future. Now, whether he got every single animal in the world or he got a few animals. Now, here's the irony of this story that I was telling you about belief systems. If you believe in evolution, you don't need that many animals. If you don't believe in evolution, God created everything the way it is we see today. You need a lot of animals. You can't morph. You can't change. You can't evolve. Well, the irony is, the less you believe in science, the more animals Noah had to stuff in that ark, which makes it even more impossible. That's an irony. Noah, of his own free will, decides he's going to build an ark, bring animals, and save his family. And he does. Somehow he either knew, or he was told, or he had a premonition, or he read the geological forces. He knew that after creation, after all these years, there are geological faults and it's going to explode. And if you read the text, it talks about the hot water in the deep coming up. There is a undercurrent of science in the story that it wasn't a man-made punishment. It wasn't weapons. It wasn't a heaven-sent thing. It was actually from within the earth. It imploded. Maybe the earth imploded because everything on earth was destroyed. Maybe the earth couldn't handle the corruption of humanity and its purpose. Whatever the case is, the text takes great pains, if you read it, to say, Niftechu kol mayanot tahom. The deep, deep wells of the deep opened. There was an upheaval. Noah was saved with his family. So is that the hallmark of a man who is simple? I think he was iconoclastic. His neighbors would mock him incessantly, and he was a man of great faith, believing in his mission. Now, the telling of the story can either be seen as factual or designed to be absurd, so as to give you a sense that it is, in fact, just a tale. But the story of Noah requires us to understand a lot of things scientifically which can happen if you believe that the flood was local, not the entire world. But to them, it looked like the entire world, let's say as far as the eye could see to the horizon. Their entire basin of where they lived in the Middle East was flooded. The waters exploded, and there was a massive upheaval, maybe connected to the splitting of the continents, the Great Rift. Who knows what happened there? Who knows? The idea that evolution can be explained when they find dinosaurs, we were told there were no dinosaurs. But what it is bones that were pickled, so to speak, chemically pickled, petrified by the floods of the water that were chemically laden, and that's how they killed everybody that they contacted, which is possible because there are a lot of chemicals in that kind of water. And therefore, whatever they find is not evolution, it's just merely God's way of setting a record of the flood in the earth. And as to the question of evolution, when we were told there were no dinosaurs, we were also told that dinosaurs may have been created during creation, but they were considered to be a not necessary species, so they died, or that they're basically they're a way of leaving clues in the earth, but they're actually never lived, or they died. They were a species that died out entirely during the flood, and the chemicals make them look like they're billions of years old, but in fact, they're really only 5,700 and something years old. A lot of complication. I don't really care. I care about the story. It doesn't bother me. None of it bothers me. Dinosaurs don't bother me. Evolution doesn't bother me. Evolution is not anti-God. Evolution is about pro-science. Well, so if Noah takes a few primary species and they evolve over time, we can explain a lot, but we don't have to. But at the end of the day, the story of Noah is a man of faith. And the conversation about faith is simple. You just believe. And the story of Noah, in my opinion, teaches us that faith is never simple. You have to work incredibly hard for what you believe in. Noah couldn't just believe. He would not have been saved. He had to build that ark. He had to stock it. He had to bring his family. He had to convince thousands and thousands of people to let him do what he did. And he had to convince his own family to do what he did. And then he had to cajole the animals into it. And then he had to figure out how to become a ship's captain and a dung sweeper at the same time. So even if Noah as a person was simple-minded in his pursuit of a concept such as the prepper, the earth is falling apart and I'm going to survive, his faith was incredibly complicated. And then we go through the story of Noah, 40 days in the ark with the rain, and then he sends out the raven, and then he sends out the dove, and the raven doesn't find a place to go, and then the dove comes back with an olive branch, and that's how he knows that there's new growth in the world. Even that's a complicated story. How long does it take for an olive branch to emerge post-flood? Think about that. Just look it up. How long does it take for an olive tree to go from pit, assuming there's an olive pit, to blossoming, to flowering, to giving off leaves? I think it's a long time. They're a very slow-growing tree. Something is up with that story. But Noah leaves the ark, and Noah, it seems, wants to forget what happened on the ark or before the ark. And what did Noah want to forget? Noah wanted to forget something that started when he was a child. When Noah was born, he was given the name Noach, which means comfort. And the text in the book of Genesis, the opening portion of Genesis, says, when he was born, they looked at him and they said, this one, Yenachamenu. This one will comfort us from the destruction we have wrought. The moment Noah was born, he was designated as the survivor, as the one who will take the world as it is and turn it into something better. Why? We don't know the history. But something about the story of Noah was, you are going to change the world and fix us from day one. Well, I think Noah got off that ark and he wanted to forget the expectation of being a Noah. He was done. He saved what he could and he was finished. How much more could someone do? He sacrificed everything for that moment. Noah wanted to forget the mockery that was made of him for years and years as he built that ark and as he tried to convince people to save themselves. He was mocked incessantly. In the end, who was he able to save? His family and some animals. Barely himself. And this is that famous story about Reb Zushia talks about, when I was young, I thought I would save the world. Then I realized I probably couldn't save the world. As I got older, I realized maybe I'll save my country. And then I got a little older, I realized probably not my country, maybe my province. Then I went to my province, and eventually I learned my city. And then I thought, my city, I can't do it. Maybe my neighborhood. Eventually, it wasn't my neighborhood anymore. It was my friends. And eventually, I thought it was my family, until ultimately, as I aged, I realized it was me. Noah was only able to save himself and a few others. Noah wanted to forget the struggle of going from whoever he was before the flood, which we know nothing about him, other than he was the designated survivor who was going to save the world. That's all we know. And that he believed that there was a flood coming. Noah wanted to forget the struggle. He wanted to forget how he became an animal keeper and, as I said, a dung sweeper. That's what he did on that ark. And how he was attacked by the animals that he tried to feed. Imagine keeping lions and tigers in a boat, and it's extraordinary. And it doesn't seem like Noah had any help. It sounds like his family came reluctantly, and they wouldn't help him. He was on his own. This is your mission, Noah. You chose this. And for all we know, Noah was blamed for the flood. Because the one who speaks up about change is often blamed for the problem. Did you know the story of Leda and Zeus and the swan? Well, you should, because that story has its origin in a midrash, which they didn't teach me in grade 1, about the raven. The raven was sent to find a place to rest after the flood and instead seduced Noah's wife. Do you know that story? It doesn't have to be true, but there's a story about the personality of the raven, and it is told through the story of Noah and Noah's naivete and his wife's decision to allow it to happen. Talks about the collapse of the social, intimate structure and the upheaval in a tiny little boat, and what it does to family, and the intimacy can either destroy you or can make you. And then, of course, Noah has to deal with the reality, and he desperately wants to forget the fact that on his watch, millions and millions of human beings, animals, and all living creatures are wiped out, and he is a survivor. Does he have any survivor's guilt? Maybe. Does he feel he could have done more? Maybe. Should he have done more? I don't know, but maybe. He feels it, and he wants to forget it. But he's not going quietly. He's angry. He is angry. And I'll tell you in a minute how we know that. But the first thing that Noah does when he gets out of the boat, or the ark, or the floating raft, or whatever box he was in, he sacrifices some animals. Yes, the kosher animals that he had, the tahor ones. It doesn't say kosher, it says the pure ones, whatever that means. Does that mean that in ancient times they differentiated between pure and impure animals? It's possible. Maybe pure meant edible, impure meant inedible. I don't know. It doesn't matter. We're not framing it in Orthodox values. He sacrifices the precious animals that he had on the ark, that he sweated and suffered to have them, to raise them, to bring them, to feed them, to clean them. He kills them. How does that make any sense? Why does he do it? If you read the text, you start to get this inkling that something is different. Noah has a new awareness about God that he didn't have before. Initially, if you read the story of his relationship with God, God is helping him save himself. But he just watched God destroy the world except for him. Vayishaer ach Noach. Only Noach was left. Only Noach and his family, or maybe barely Noach. He barely survived. That's all that's left. And what does he understand now about God? God loves the sweet smell of sacrifice, the burning of flesh, the destruction of living things is what God wants. Imagine Noah coming to this realization that his entire toil ultimately was part of the greatest destruction of humanity and people and things and living creatures ever. So he now knows how to respond. I know what you want, he says. You want me to kill, sacrifice, burn, destroy living things? That makes you happy. It was your world. It was your plan. It was your efforts. And you've destroyed it. You must like that. So he destroys. And then, of course, now being co-opted in a destructive mission, he can't take it anymore. And he desperately scrambles to plant a vineyard. It takes time for a vineyard to grow. So he must have been waiting quite a while. And the story in the text collapses it. He planted a vineyard and he got drunk. As if he couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't take it. He couldn't live with his trauma. He couldn't live with the fact that he, even unwittingly, was the enabler of the greatest destruction of humanity and living things. And he couldn't take the flashbacks of living in an ark, a boat, a creaky, leaky boat with the stench of animals in their waste, his family hating him and barely surviving. He was traumatized beyond imagination. And all he wanted was to find somewhere else to exist. So he planted a vineyard, he fermented his grapes, and he got drunk. Could you imagine being on a ship under those circumstances without an end date? Now, he had no idea how long the flood would last. He had no idea whether they'd be there for 40 days of rain and a year of floating, 2 years of floating, 3 years. But they were there a long time. At least a year, plus 40 days and 40 nights. Can you imagine what the rain and the sound of the rain can do to you after one day it's no longer nice? And the humidity and the wetness and the dampness, and after 40 days and 40 nights of that, cooped up in a boat with a little tiny window that would have been dark the whole time, and you couldn't go outside because there was acid rain, and then not knowing how long you're going to be trapped. It might feel a little bit like COVID does, where you just don't know when it's going to be over. If we knew when it was going to be over, it wouldn't be as hard. We just don't know. Noah is so traumatized, he plants a vineyard and he escapes. And he's re-traumatized because there's a story, an incident that happens with his children and grandchildren. You should read up on it. It's not a good story. Ham is cursed. The origin of black racism certainly comes from the minds of humanity, where they distinguish color. But the real origin of the permission to be racist to black people comes from this week's portion, in which Canaan and Ham are involved in some incident, and Noah curses them and declares that Cush, whatever his name was, Mr. Cush, will be a slave forever. And Cush happens to be the word for Cushi, black, or the people of Africa. And from there, he will be a slave forever. They extrapolated permission not only to see color, because if you read the story of Noah, he's got 3 kids. The whole world derives from those 3 kids through evolution, yes. 3 children, the whole world, but the ones who were black were cursed by Noah. So they say. Do we really know? Doesn't matter. Do we agree is more important? And looking back for generations, permission was taken from the Bible, whether you were Christian or Jew, to understand the black people as subservient. You need to look at this chapter. You need to understand it. You need to understand that this wasn't just domination of one culture over another or one color over another. They gave themselves divine authority to act this way. They believe that God determined this in origin. And who's going to argue with God? You see how important it is to have miracles? Because with miracles, you can get away with anything. You can manipulate any story to make it what you want. Because faith, as I said, is complex. But they've made it simple. If you just believe what we tell you, we'll tell you what you want to hear. Noah is re-traumatized while drunk. The curse comes out of that. Terrible things emanate from that ultimately. And we are the children of which one of Noah's sons? Shem. Hey, have you asked yourself where the word Semite comes from? An anti-Semite, an anti-Semite, a Semitic people, Semitic language. Where does Semite come from? From Shem. Well, if you're an anti-Shemite, you're actually anti a lot more than Jews. You're anti all of Shem's descendants. But we believe that the Jewish people, initially at least, Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and so on, were descended from Shem, which the text tells us how. But Shem had many children. We have many, many, many cousins. And in our origin story, we were all brothers and sisters. Then you have to ask yourself, of course, why are the women left out of the story? The only reference we have is that in the text that we read, that they gave birth to sons and daughters. But really only the sons are referenced. You have to ask yourself, was that part of the origin story? Where they separated men and women and they said men are important and women are not? And is that something we should believe in? Or is that something we should not believe in or fight against? Why are some of the origin stories still okay and others are not? And that's why miracles scare me, because you can get anybody to do anything you want if you can always backstop your hypocrisy or the lies or the fractures or the disambiguation with a miracle. Whenever things go wrong, it's a miracle. Nope, I did not steal the money. It was a miracle. It just magically went from your account to mine. Hashem wanted it that way. So friends, what a powerfully interesting story Noah brings to us. And don't ever look at the story in the text and say, well, it says this, it has to mean that, it has to mean something, and it doesn't necessarily deviate from its primary meaning, so long as you're willing to accept that there are either flaws or emptiness in the story, or there are gaps. That's your place. That's where you belong. Find yourself in this story. And what will you do when you emerge from the bobbing arc of COVID? Every day seems oppressive. It's another day. More numbers, more rules, more worries, more fears, more anxieties, more heartbreak, more ridiculous protest, more. And we don't know. We don't know if a vaccine will be found soon. We hope it will. We don't know if it will work on everybody. We hope so. We don't know. And that is the trauma of being Noah, is having done everything right in your life, having struggled hard to be on a mission that is worthwhile, and not have it all taken away from you, but rather never know when you'll be able to return to your own good mission. And I wish you all a lot of strength on that journey. And I hope that you don't walk out of the ark and plant a vineyard and try to leave the planet. And I hope you don't get caught up in the question of, if God really runs the world, why are millions and millions of people dying? Why can't they be saved? No, that's not your place. Your place is to find a way to untraumatize. Use what happened, make it better. Don't get drunk emotionally or intellectually with trauma, and leave all the good lessons behind. I wish you all well. Shabbat Shalom. We'll be back in a few minutes with conclusion of services.